Hi, I'm Pam Bennett, and I'm here to talk to you today about landscaping with native plants. I'm an associate professor with Ohio State University Extension and also the horticulture educator in Clark County, as well as a state master gardener volunteer coordinator. I want you to start thinking about native plants. Why is it important to have native plants? According to the Audubon Society, as you see here, restoring this native plant habitat is vital to preserving biodiversity. If you think about many landscapes, just look around your neighborhood. When neighborhoods are cleared out, suburb areas are cleared out, there ends up being no plants in those particular areas, let alone the native plants that might have been there. So we're trying to create this patch of habitat that will be something that can sustain living landscape, sustain the living landscape for birds and other animals. I want you to close your eyes for just a minute and think in your mind, picture what you think a native garden looks like. Okay? Is that native garden a beautiful, well-manicured garden, or is that native garden what some might consider a patch of weeds? I'm going to show a few pictures here, the next few slides, and I want you to kind of think about, are these indeed native plant gardens? This one, or how about this one, or this one? Do you consider this a native plant garden? Or this one? This water garden? Are coneflowers part of a native plant garden? What about this one? Is this a native plant you might find in a wild or a woodland area? So as you can see, native plant gardens take on a wide variety of appearances. They can be all native plants, or they can be a mix of native plants incorporated into your landscape. And that's something that I am more for, as opposed to just complete all native plants. I like native plants, I have them in my landscape, but I also like introduced plant species as well. What I try to stay away from, of course, is invasive species. So let's take a look at native plants. Does it have to be all native plants? Can it be a mix of native plants and introduced species? Do you like just an all native plant garden? And again, that perception, some people think all native plants are weeds. Do you like tomatoes? Tomatoes are from South America. Do you like peppers? They're from Mexico and Central and Northern South America. So the point is, if you like all natives and you're going to go all native plants and be a purist, you may not have all the other plants that you like. And don't feel guilty if you don't have an all native plant garden, because as I said, mixing them in with your landscape is one way to achieve that pollinator protection and create that habitat, but also have the enjoyment of all plants in general. So let's talk about pollinators. Pollinators can be animals of any kind, insects, they can be birds, they can be mammals, but the main thing with pollinators is they move that pollen from the male anthers to the female stigma in order for pollination to occur. They fertilize the plants, which results, of course, in the seeds and fruit, and they can be mutually beneficial. Keep in mind, pollinators in general, not just the bees, but pollinators in general, are necessary for 3/4 of our world's food crop. Here's a list of all the different pollinators that we are considering right now. Honeybees, of course, are the ones that have been in the news the most. We're seeing many bee species decline, bee populations decline. So honeybees are probably in top of everybody's mind. But don't forget butterflies, wasps, beetles, flies, birds, bats. There's several of these different species that are also pollinators. What we're seeing right now tends to be a loss of habitat, as I mentioned, with a suburban neighborhood being developed. The pollinators, maybe the native plants, the weeds that were there, and weeds can be pollinators also, or weeds can be used for pollination. That habitat is lost and they don't have any plants or flowers. We do see pesticides becoming an issue, whether they're agricultural pesticides or we spray them improperly in our garden, or a beekeeper may have had issues with their bees and pesticides. We also see pest problems within the pollinators. With bees, we see colony collapse disorder, mites, and viruses that can knock down some of the bees. And then climate change can also be a factor. So the basic, there's not one pinpoint problem here that we can say this is the reason that we're losing our pollinators. There's a lot of reasons. So what can we do to help increase the population of pollinators? And one of those things, of course, is consider pollinator needs and plant native plants as well as other plants. So pollinators need food, water, shelter, some place to hide. They like travel corridors, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that here shortly. They need safety. They need to be secure. Think about birds in the landscape. If you don't have any trees or shrubs for them to hide in, they're not as likely to come to your bird feeder. And they need space in kind of a suitable arrangement where they can go from one group of flowers or plants to the next. So I want you to look at your landscape, and I want you to evaluate your landscape and your garden like a pollinator would. Think about a butterfly, how a butterfly would move throughout your landscape. Are there patches of flowers where they can go from one to the other, or is there just one patch, and then if you look around the entire neighborhood, there's nothing else for them to feed on or rely on? So you want to include flowers with attractive color patterns and aromas, and here's some examples. Plants that release pollen easily from the anther, that the pollinators don't have to kind of struggle to get it. Pollen with high protein content, and plants that are going to give those pollinators a nectar reward when they come and visit. You want to aim for flowers all year round to help our pollinators. Start in early spring and go through late fall to provide food sources. Here you've got an example of red maple, summer sweet clethra that blooms in the early summer. You've got hyacinths that are early spring and are excellent for pollinators. Bottom left-hand corner, you've got boxwoods. Most people don't really think of boxwoods as good for pollinators, but those blooms in the early spring are loaded with bees. The middle bottom is buttonbush. That's a great native plant to be used in a landscape if you have a large space, 10 to 12 foot in height and width. Very attractive for pollinators. And on the right-hand side is an introduced plant called sedum that you'll find right now that is loaded with pollinators. The other thing to kind of keep in mind if you're trying to landscape with these plants, include at least 3 species in bloom each season. So this is kind of a real quick and easy formula to think about when you want to increase the pollinator plants in your landscape. Include 3 species in each season. So 3 in the spring, 3 in the summer, 3 in the fall. And that will help spread out that bloom season so that they have something all season long. In the center, you see an annual Verbena bonariensis, which I've got to tell you, it's not a native plant, but it is an outstanding plant for pollinator. In the early spring, even in the late winter, in February and March, you'll see witch hazel, the bottom left. And on the right-hand side, you'll see asters, which are great for fall pollinators. And we do have many native asters as well. So what you want to try to do is provide season-long color, season-long nectar, and season-long pollen so that these pollinators, as they come out and start working through the landscape, they can start finding places to feed and to gather the pollen and the nectar. The other rule of thumb here is to also include masses of colors. They see these big masses, so instead of a single plant here and there, you can see in the back here how we've used the asters in a mass. In the front left-hand corner, we've got yarrow in a mass. So we try to put plants in masses so that they're attracted to those plants. In small areas, you can plant single species, but put them together again to increase that visibility. So you don't have to have 5 acres to create a pollinator landscape or include native plants in your landscape. You can have a very small space, but again, put them in clumps and in groupings together. Oops, too fast. Include a diversity of flower shapes. So as you look at native plants and even your introduced species, look at the different flower shapes. Typically, butterflies like to land on those flat top flowers, like the ones you see in the bottom area. They like to feed on those, the bottom yarrow, the left-hand side, the coneflower. They like the monarda in the top center, and monarda is a native plant. They also, if you have tubular flowers, you know that hummingbirds like those. So look at your flowers, go through your landscape, look at the flowers and see what you have and find out what you might be missing as well. In addition, you can connect fragmented habitats by using your garden. Now this is a little bit overkill, of course. You wouldn't have something like this. This is at Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden. But this is kind of giving you the idea where you connect those habitats. So if you have trees and shrubs in the front yard and then nothing in the side yard, and you have some plants in the backyard, maybe you need something to help connect those habitats so those pollinators can get from site to site. Here's an example of connecting that habitat together. We're adding this nice row here of daisies and some monarda, some lavender. Now these aren't native plants, but there are ways we can help connect those pathways. Here's an example of a native plant garden that, again, you have a border here along the side that has some goldenrods in it. It has a variety of different native plants that is used to connect this area of the landscape to this area of the landscape. So think about that connector, because I don't think that people sometimes tend to think about, they don't go very far. Pollinators can't fly all that far without a food source, so you've got to help them out by giving them those connections. Here's just an example of an area that's all green and no areas for pollinators to kind of travel through, and by putting this catmint in here, they're able to come through here and provide foods, get a food source. Keep in mind, small bees may fly less than 500 feet, bumblebees up to 1 mile. So having that corridor to help them is very valuable. Another thing to do is to create your habitats close to crops and gardens. And this can include native plants, and again, I'm talking about native and introduced here, and I'll talk about native specifically more here shortly, but this is just some general things to do in order to really improve those habitats. I plant my perennial bed, my perennial border, down alongside of the flower or the vegetable garden. You can see broccoli here in front. Some of it has gone to seed during the heat of the summer, but I have my native plant garden and my flowers along the edge here, so that they're going to help me out with pollinating or getting into the flower beds. They can get that pollen source, but they can also help pollinate some of my vegetable gardens. Focus on floral abundance and diversity. So you want lots of flowers. This is what your pollinators are going to be needing, and this is what we can use for native habitats. In addition, don't forget that there's caterpillars, the larvae, that need some of these plants as well. So there are going to be some foliage plants such as dill, parsley, that you'll need too for some of these caterpillars. Milkweed is another one that people like to use. So the recommendation from many people is to use local native plants, and this will help provide species-rich pollinator communities. In the top left corner, you see in a woodland area, hepatica. The bottom is mountain mint, which is an incredible plant for pollinators, and it is a native plant. It will spread, but it can be kept under control. And again, on the right-hand side, you see this picture of the perennial border that is loaded with all native plants. And you know, if your perspective is, wow, native plants are messy, I think this top right picture just proves that that's not necessarily true. Now, here's the big question. Cultivars versus hybrids versus native plants. You might hear a purist native plant person say, only use native plants. Well, I'm not a purist. I'm the first one to tell you that. I like cultivars, I like hybrids, I like all these other different plants that are available for the landscape. But what I try to do is use cultivars or hybrids of these native plants. This is a type of sedum that is a cultivar. It is truly loaded with pollinators. Now, the only thing that we don't know right now, and I know there's some people out at Oregon State studying this, is the protein and the pollen in this particular plant, these cultivars, is this as good as our native white sedum? So there's still some research, some studies to be done to find out, okay, so we have these cultivars, we have these hybrids, we call them nativars in many cases. Are they as good of a pollen source as our natives are? And that research is happening right now. So in my opinion, it's a great thing to have pollinator-friendly plants, including new ones, introduced ones, and then also our true native plants. I want you also to think about making pollinator-friendly plant choices. Observe your garden. Remember earlier I said go through your garden and act like you're a pollinator and see what's missing. Look at those particular plants and see and determine, do they attract pollinators? Are they pollinator magnets, or do the pollinators stay away? For instance, salvia, many of the salvias make great pollinator plants, the native salvias as well as the introduced ones. And this leaf cutter bee, not leaf cutter, This, I can't, the name just left me. This particular bee, which is the one that bores holes, and I'm totally blank, but Marty, I'm sure, can tell you, or Carrie. This particular bee actually drills in the side of this particular plant and robs the pollen from it and the nectar from it. If you see right here, this is the hole that it is actually drilled. Here's another great pollinator plant, a celosia. So what I'm suggesting is that you go through your garden and identify those plants that pollinators really like. And if you can't go through your garden, if you see other landscapes, if you see arboretums, if you see trial gardens, visit these and see which plants the pollinators are visiting. Here's an example of viewing or observing pollinator plants. Cleome, the species Cleome or spider plant, is an excellent pollinator plant for honeybees, butterflies. I've seen hummingbirds on them. It's fantastic. However, this is a hybrid called Senorita rosalita. And Senorita rosalita was bred so that, number one, it keeps this foliage down at the base, and it lasts all season long, and it has just strong, vivid color. However, it was also bred so that it doesn't reseed. Therefore, it is sterile. It has flowers that attract the honeybees and the bumblebees. They're all coming after this, and they all love this, but they can't find any pollen. So it's not necessarily a good pollinator plant. These are in our field trials in Springfield, Ohio, and again, we evaluate, we observe these and see which ones are attractive to pollinators. So by having a mix of these, you might like this plant, don't feel guilty planting it, but be sure you put other native plants or other plants in your landscape that will attract bees. Some plants, or not just bees, but pollinators in general. Some plants are buffets. You know, our native milkweeds, our snake plant, our snakeroot, I'm sorry, our goldenrods, native goldenrods, not the introduced goldenrod, which is still is a pollinator plant, but our native goldenrods. So these native plants, many of them in our landscapes that we can incorporate in our landscapes, are very, very good for pollinators. And again, as it says, monarchs are, the caterpillars feed on native milkweeds as well. So when it comes to pollinators and native plants, we have trees, shrubs, and perennials and annual flowers. So we have a whole range of plants that we can utilize in the garden. This list shows you some of our native trees. So if you were thinking about 3 seasons, 3 species in each season, do you have any of these native trees in your landscape? Redbud's native, can be put as an understory tree, our native Florida, Cornus Florida, serviceberries, and so forth. So these are excellent trees to use in your landscape. So if you have these in your landscape, again, evaluate what you have and then add additional plants that you don't have. In terms of shrubs, I mentioned earlier the, one of my favorites, the buttonbush. I don't see it on here on this list, but buttonbush is a good one. Summer sweet clethra, fothergilla that blooms early spring. You also would have your spireas that are, we have native spireas, we have introduced spireas, they're all great, and then you have your Itea or Virginia sweet spire. And then we have a plethora of native perennials that you'll find in the eastern and Midwest United States. And in the upper corner, we have lupine here, we have baptisia. The right hand, we have cassia, or popcorn plant, as some people know it. Bottom left, we have asters, mountain mint, and liatris. These are all beautiful plants. They're native plants, and there's really no reason why we can't incorporate them into our landscape. Now with the asters, not everybody likes the New England aster, which is the one that gets about 2.5, 3 feet tall. It's blooming right now in central Ohio. It grows in kind of a vase shape, and one of the big problems with it is as it grows, if it's not supported, it gets top heavy and falls over. There are other cultivars or nativars of asters that can be used as well. But again, you want to check them out and see if actually, they're attracting some of these pollinators to these plants. I'll go through a couple more plants here that are native that I've planted in my garden. The American ginger. This is a great early spring plant. I really like it because it's a nice ground cover. It kind of stays a little bit semi-evergreen, but it does well in a heavy, deep shade. I've actually got it planted under black locust tree, so that's a dry shade, and it actually does really well here. This is in the early spring when it first starts coming up. And ginger has the most beautiful flower blossom that you probably will never see unless you know to look for it. And if you look right underneath that leaf, you see these little flower buds. I'd say usually around early to mid-April, they get ready to start blooming. And then by mid to late April, you see these incredible crimson flowers that are just fantastic. And they're pollinated by ground beetles and flies. So don't forget, it's just not honeybees and caterpillars and moths and butterflies. It's all the other pollinators as well. But I really like this in the landscape as a native plant. A little tough to get started and get established, but once it got established, it's done well. One thing to keep in mind, do not go out to our wild natural areas or wildlife areas and pull or dig any of these native plants. That is forbidden, it's taboo. Do not deplete our native landscapes, our natural areas, but there are stores, there are landscapes, there are people who buy them, or who sell them rather, native nurseries. I happened to get mine from a friend who had a woodland area, and they were going to tear some trees and kind of clear out an area for a building. I said, hey, can I come in and rescue these? So I got a whole bunch, cutleaf toothwort, mayapple, a whole bunch of native plants that I was able to bring in. So do not go out to our natural areas and just start digging. I love this particular plant. This is mayapple. The top left is when it first comes out, and that's when I think it looks the coolest. It looks like it's almost an umbrella unfolding. And then the bottom, if you look at the flower bud there in the middle, it will open up to a beautiful white blossom that's great for pollinators. The one thing about mayapples that are really interesting is they'll only bloom if they have this double leaf. So this Y leaf is the only way you'll see them blooming. Single leaves will not bloom. Another great native plant that I was also able to dig up and transplant very easily is Virginia bluebells, an early April native pollinator plant. And I actually purchased this at a Home Depot or Lowe's years ago. This is a yellow lily, or I'm sorry, a yellow allium. I purchased this at a Home Depot in packets or bags. So you'll find these and come across these in various locations. But again, there are native plant nurseries that sell these. This is probably one of my favorite earliest native plants. This is columbine, our native columbine, Aquilegia. You can see it here mixed in with hostas. It blooms in April. It is what we call a spring ephemeral. And those spring ephemerals come up when it's cool, bloom in the spring, and then when it gets hot, they die out completely. And this is just great for a woodland area because it reseeds prolifically. And because it dies back in the early spring, who cares if it reseeds prolifically, because it can just filter and spot and dust the entire shady area with this beautiful red and yellow color in the spring. So this is our native columbine that I think is one of the greatest ones for early spring in a woodland area. Then of course we have native prairie gardens that you can do. I'm fortunate, I have 5 acres of land, so I have my perennial garden in which I've incorporated native plants, but I also have this, I'd say it's about a 1/4 acre prairie. And I was able to get some seeds from Guy Denny, who was a former director of the Department of Natural Resources, Natural Area Preserves many years ago. And I mowed everything really tight. I mowed it tight for 2 years. And then I came in and scattered the seed everywhere. I also kept mowing it for a couple years until I knocked down some of the other weeds and let these guys get established. And I now have several different native grasses, blue stem. I have Silphium laciniatum, which is here on the left, the compass plant. I have prairie dock, which is here on the right. I have monarda, the native monarda right here. I have quite a few coneflowers. I have a whole mix of prairie plants that have just finally really started to take over. And this is an excellent addition to my landscape. Like I said, I have 5 acres. Behind me is a cornfield. There's no pathway for pollinators back there. And this year I think it was soybeans. So not having flowers in that big cornfield, I'm able to provide this native habitat. I also have some milkweed in here for the monarch butterflies, but it's an excellent habitat for birds. They love the seeds from the coneflower. So it's been a lot of fun growing it and having this prairie. And it's just been really cool to see all the animals and pollinators that come through here. I also was able to purchase approximately 5 or 6 different cultivars of native plants or native, I'm sorry, native, yeah, my mind's blank again, native goldenrod. This is stiff goldenrod. I have Riddell's goldenrod. I planted them 3 years ago and haven't been able to find them, but they're still in the same corner where I planted them. And I kind of dug in here this last week, and I actually was able to find them coming up and growing nicely. So I've kind of taken down some of the weeds around there, and I'm trying to kind of help them along. A prairie is a bit of a challenge. Anytime you do a natural area like this, you're going to have weeds in here as well. So you really have to work on it to get your good plants growing and knock the weeds down. Once the good plants grow, the native plants grow, then it really takes over, and all I do is burn it about every 2 to 3 years. So this is for building a bee-friendly, but it also can be building a pollinator-friendly landscape, just again to keep in mind. The spring, there's a list of all the different plants that would bloom in the spring. Early summer, your trees and shrubs that would bloom in early summer, and then late summer. And these are all native plants. You've got heptacodium, which is one that's blooming right now that looks beautiful. Buttonbush, like I said, I love that. Now, I'm sorry, they're not all native plants. They're native and introduced. But this is a good example to plant some from each column. And again, if you keep 3 seasons, 3 species in mind, it kind of makes it easy as you start to inventory your landscape to see what you actually have and what you need. Another thing that's really important when you're trying to attract the pollinators and you're using native plants, it's a great thing to incorporate these native plants, but if you're not paying attention to your pest management strategies, especially in your cultivated plants, you're going to run into some challenges. Some people say native plants don't have any problems. They don't have any pests. Well, we know that's not true. They have specific pests. My mayapple every year gets mayapple rust, but I don't worry about it. It eventually dies out because of the heat of the summer. It dies out, but it comes back every year, so I don't worry about that. So I use integrated pest management, particularly if you have a native plant like my buttonbush that maybe I don't want the insects to feed on it. However, it is a great host for a caterpillar, so it's something you really have to think about. Keep plants healthy, right plant, right location. Use other options. IPM, integrated pest management, means other options for controlling pests. If you have some really good plants that you don't want the caterpillars to get on, use row covers. In the vegetable garden, rotate your crops. Use resistant varieties if you can find those when available. Clean up, sanitation. If you are going to use chemicals, choose the right product for the pest problem. I try to go with some of the real softer things such as soaps or oils, and not dish soap, but horticultural soap that's labeled as a pesticide, and also oils that are horticultural oils labeled as pesticides. So pest management is really important. Now in my prairie, I don't do any pest management except on the Silphium, the Leuciniatum, the prairie dock, and the compass plant. The head clipping weevils now have come in there and are really messing with them and knocking off the flower heads so I don't get any seed production. So I am using hand picking to go in and pick those out so that they don't overwinter and become a problem. Again, limit pesticide use in the landscape. Be part of the solution, and just a pun, sorry about that. But consider the different types of products that you're using. Read the label always. Don't use a product that's just going to knock everything out. We want to attract the good guys in order to kill the bad guys. Make smart decisions. You know, pesticides are labeled that you cannot spray them when pollinators are out. So think about, when are your pollinators out and feeding on your plants? If you have a bed of coneflowers and you've got Japanese beetles feeding on them and you don't want them to damage these coneflowers, well, you're not going to want to spray in the middle of the day when they're in full bloom, because that's going to cause issues for our pollinators. So keep in mind the time of the day, formulation, inert ingredients, and just an FYI, herbicides and fungicides are pesticides. It's a common misnomer that people don't understand. Pesticides is the umbrella. Herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, molluscicides, everything else falls under that pesticide. Pest means to kill, or side means to kill. So side, you're killing a pest. So keep that in mind. The other thing is tolerate some damage. Redbud is a great native plant to use in the landscape, but you may see some damage like this. This is epimedium. The leafcutter bee loves epimedium, redbud, some of your hostas. They will come in and just chew these little circular pieces or half moon pieces out of your leaf. They'll take that tissue back and use that for their nest. Well, it's a one time in the spring problem. You know, unless you're showing these plants for a blue ribbon at the fair, there's really no reason to worry about spraying or trying to control these pests. It really is something that, you know, you just have to tolerate sometimes. Develop a tolerance for weeds to reduce herbicide use. So everybody knows that bees love dandelions. Dandelions come out in the early spring. If you don't like dandelions, that's okay too. But if you're going to get rid of all your dandelions or your clover, provide something else, another native plant or another introduced species that the pollinators like that time of the year. My husband and I have different opinions on what the lawn should look like. He thinks lawns should be green. I don't really care what color lawns are. They can be yellow, they can be white with clover. They can't be purple with violets because violets have gotten into my flower beds and are really difficult to control. So we've compromised, and up near the house and around the house, he keeps it nice and green. And I make sure my landscape beds and away from the house, my prairie and all the other things around the garden have native plants and other plants for pollinators. Invite beneficial insects to help manage these pests. Learn how to identify. You see some of these beneficial pests right here, ladybird beetles, there's parasitoid wasps, the syrphid fly. Syrphid fly is really interesting. It's actually a fly, and remember, flies only have 2 wings. Bees have 2 pairs of wings or 4 wings. In the summertime, usually around late July, early August, you'll see all these little tiny flies that people think they're sweat bees. They're annoying. They're not sweat bees. They're syrphid flies. So they're actually beneficial. And they come in, they're pollinators, and their larvae also feed on soft-bodied insects. So learn how to identify, and before you use any kind of pesticides, identify the good guys and see if they're going to be able to take out the bad guys. And then also plant those plants, native or introduced, that attract some of these pollinators. So think about inviting those beneficial pests to help you as opposed to using pesticides. So I'd like to wrap up with telling you and urging you to go native, go wild, but don't feel guilty if you're just going to do an entire, you don't have to do all native plants and have a native plant landscape. The perception still is native plants can look messy, and that's okay. If you like your manicured garden, you can still incorporate many native plants into a manicured garden. I have Rudbeckia maxima, or tall coneflower. I have Joe Pye weed. I have a nativar or a cultivar of a goldenrod called Fireworks. They're all incorporated into my landscape, and they still look fantastic. It doesn't look like a native wild plant mess. My bottom line is just plant something. Go out and plant something that is beneficial to pollinators. Mums aren't native, but they sure are, or daisies rather aren't native, but they sure are helpful for pollinators. The top center picture is sunflowers. The yellow spots are to represent pollen. Sunflowers are extremely beneficial to birds. They're not native, but the birds love them. So if you're not specifically focused on native plants, just plant something. Plant something and enjoy the whole act of gardening. Here's some resources for you to use. The Pollinator Partnership is a great organization. Denise Ellsworth, who's doing a talk in the Utzinger Garden on the attracting pollinators, she is great when it comes to pollinators and bees, and you can see her address there, u.osu.edu/beelab. She does a fantastic job. And then there's the Xerces Society and other resources. I want to thank you for your time here at the Gwynn programs. I hope you've enjoyed virtual Farm Science Review. It sure would have been nice to be there this week, but hopefully next year we'll be there to see you. Thank you all.